My name is Claire Whitmore, and for 31 years, my own family thought I was a failure. They had a name for what I did. They called it Claire's nothing job. Not because they knew what I actually did every day, not because they had ever asked a single real question about it. They called it that because it didn't come with a title they could brag about at dinner parties. It didn't come with a corner office they could show off. It didn't come with a designer bag or a company car. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, not my mother, not my father, not my sister Vanessa, and not her husband Bradley, the man who liked to call himself a self-made entrepreneur, was that my quiet, boring, forgettable job was about to become the reason their entire world collapsed in a courtroom, in front of everyone they'd ever tried to impress. This is the story of how one afternoon, in a room with wooden benches and fluorescent lights, a judge said 11 words that made my mother's face turn white, made my sister grip the table so hard her knuckles went pale, and made my father, the man who once told me I'd never amount to anything sitting behind a desk, sit in silence for the first time in his life. But to understand how we got to that courtroom, you need to understand something about where I came from and how a person can spend an entire childhood being told, gently and not so gently, that she is the less interesting one. I grew up in a house where attention was a limited resource, and somehow, without anyone ever announcing it out loud, it had all been allocated to my older sister Vanessa before I was even born. Vanessa was the firstborn, the pretty one, the one who won the school pageants and the debate trophies, and later, the corporate internships that our parents bragged about to every neighbor who would listen. I was 2 years younger, and by the time I was old enough to understand family dynamics, I already understood my role. I was the quiet one, the reader, the girl who liked numbers more than parties, who felt more comfortable with a puzzle than a crowd. My father was a proud man, the kind who measured success in visible, countable things: houses, cars, job titles that sounded impressive at the barbecue. My mother adored him, and over the years adopted his way of seeing the world almost entirely as her own. Between the two of them, there was an unspoken hierarchy in our home, and I existed somewhere near the bottom of it, tolerated, occasionally praised for good grades, but never truly seen the way Vanessa was seen. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because it matters for what comes later. Because when you grow up learning to expect very little recognition, you learn something else alongside it. You learn to work quietly, to find satisfaction in doing something well, even when nobody claps for it. That skill, that strange, hard-won patience, would end up being the exact thing that saved my family, years later, when everything they valued came crashing down. But to understand how we got to that courtroom, you need to understand how it all started. And it didn't start with a lawsuit. It started with a turkey dinner, 3 years ago, when my family laughed at me one time too many. I want you to imagine a family gathering, the kind where everyone dresses a little nicer than usual, where the good china comes out, where everyone has a role they play without even thinking about it. In my family, my father played the proud patriarch. My mother played the woman who agreed with everything he said. My sister Vanessa played the golden child who could do no wrong. Her husband Bradley played the loud, confident guy who always had a business idea that was about to blow up. Bradley never had, not once in the 10 years I'd known him, an idea that actually blew up. But nobody in my family ever pointed that out, because it wasn't Bradley's job to be right. It was his job to be impressive. And me? I played the role I'd been given since I was 12 years old. I was the quiet one, the plain one, the one who read too many books and didn't have ambition. When I told my family, at 24 years old, that I'd taken a position as a forensic auditor for a state regulatory division, my father looked at me across the table and said, "So you're an accountant now. Fun." That was it. That was the entire conversation. Fun. Like I'd told him I'd joined a community theater group. Like the years of study, the licensing exams, the sleepless nights preparing for certification, all of it added up to nothing more than a hobby. I didn't correct him. I never corrected any of them. Because somewhere along the way, I had learned that in my family, correcting people only made things worse. If I explained what I actually did, that I investigated financial fraud, that I had helped uncover embezzlement schemes worth millions of dollars, that state agencies called me in when something didn't add up, they wouldn't hear pride. They would hear me trying to compete with Vanessa. And in my family, there was an unspoken rule that nobody was allowed to compete with Vanessa. Vanessa had always been the star. Vanessa had the sorority, the wedding with 400 guests, the husband who owned 3 businesses, even if none of us could say what those businesses actually did. So I sat quietly at every dinner, every holiday, every birthday, and I let them believe what they wanted to believe. I was Claire, the daughter with the nothing job. The daughter who probably wouldn't ever afford a house of her own. The daughter who, as my mother liked to say with a small, pitying smile, found her own kind of happiness in her own small way. I let them believe it for 3 years. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, a case landed on my desk that would change everything. A case with a name on it that made my hands go cold the moment I saw it. The name on the file was Bradley Kessler, my sister's husband. But before I tell you what was in that file, I want to take a step back and tell you how I actually got to that desk in the first place, because I think it matters for understanding why I was able to do what I eventually did. I studied accounting in college, not because it was glamorous, but because I liked the way numbers behaved. Numbers didn't lie to make themselves look better. Numbers didn't perform for an audience. If something was wrong, the numbers eventually showed it, no matter how carefully someone tried to hide it. There was a kind of honesty in that discipline that I found deeply comforting, especially growing up in a household where appearances often mattered more than substance. After college, I took an entry-level position at a small regional accounting firm, doing unglamorous work, tax preparation, small business bookkeeping, the kind of job that never came up in conversation at family gatherings because nobody found it interesting enough to ask about. It was during my 3rd year there that I stumbled into what would become my true calling. A client's business had unusual patterns in its books, small inconsistencies that most people would have overlooked or dismissed as clerical errors. I didn't dismiss them. I kept pulling at that thread until it unraveled into a case of internal embezzlement that had been going on for almost 4 years, committed by a trusted employee who had been with the company since it opened. That case was reported to the State Regulatory Division, and one of their senior investigators, a woman who would later become my mentor, personally called our firm to commend the quality of the documentation I had prepared. She told my supervisor that in 20 years of reviewing referred cases, she had rarely seen such careful, complete work from someone so early in their career. She asked if I'd ever consider working in forensic investigation. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. I went back to school part-time for specialized certification in forensic accounting while continuing to work full-time, studying financial fraud detection, understanding shell company structures, learning to trace transactions through complicated layers of accounts, designed specifically to confuse anyone who might come looking. It took me nearly 3 years of night classes, licensing exams, and unpaid overtime hours to become fully certified. I remember calling my parents the night I passed my final certification exam, genuinely excited, wanting to share the moment with someone. My mother's response was, "That's nice, honey. Did you hear that Vanessa got promoted to senior manager?" I didn't blame her for that response back then, not really. I had grown so used to being background noise in my own family's story that I almost expected it. But it still stung, quietly, in a place I didn't examine too closely. When the State Regulatory Division eventually offered me a full-time position as a forensic auditor, I took it immediately, even though the salary, at least at the start, was modest compared to what Vanessa was earning in her corporate marketing role. My father's reaction to that news was the "accountant now fun" comment I mentioned earlier, a comment that, small as it was, told me everything about how this new chapter of my life would be received at home. I want to be clear about something, though. I never resented the work itself, not even for a moment. Every case I took on, no matter how small, felt like solving a puzzle that actually mattered to someone's life. Small business fraud that threatened a family's livelihood. insurance fraud that raised premiums for entire communities, and eventually, cases involving public pension funds, where the victims weren't abstract numbers on a page, but real retirees who had worked their entire lives trusting that their savings would be there when they needed them. I loved that work fiercely, quietly, without ever needing anyone at a dinner table to understand why. I remember that Tuesday like it happened this morning. I remember the smell of the burnt coffee in our office break room, the hum of the old air conditioning unit that never quite worked right, and the moment my supervisor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Okafor, dropped a thick manila folder on my desk and said, "This one's yours. State Pension Board flagged irregular withdrawals tied to a shell investment group. Might be nothing. Might be a lot of something." I opened the folder expecting numbers, spreadsheets, wire transfer logs. What I did not expect was to see, printed clearly on the cover page, the name of the company under investigation, Kessler Capital Partners. My stomach dropped. Kessler Capital Partners was Bradley's company, the third business he loved to talk about at family dinners, the one he described as private equity, very exclusive, very high-level stuff you wouldn't understand. I remembered him saying that directly to my father once, with a smug little laugh, as if finance was something only he had ever touched. I sat there for a long moment with my hand on that folder, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt. I did not feel excited. I did not feel like this was my chance for revenge. I felt sick, because whatever was inside that folder, it wasn't just about Bradley. It was about my sister. It was about my parents, who I later learned had put money into Bradley's fund. It was about people's retirement savings, real people, teachers and firefighters and city workers, whose pensions had been quietly funneled into an investment vehicle that, on paper, looked far too good to be real. I almost asked Diane to reassign the case. I told her honestly that the subject of the investigation was connected to my family. In my line of work, that kind of conflict matters. Diane looked at me for a long moment and said something I've never forgotten. "Claire, that's exactly why I want you on it. You know how these people talk. You know how they think. And more importantly, I trust you not to look the other way just because it's convenient." She was right to trust me, but she didn't know how hard the next 8 months would be. I want to walk you through what I found, slowly, the way I found it, because the details matter. Kessler Capital Partners had been operating for 6 years. On paper, it presented itself as a boutique investment firm specializing in alternative real estate assets. Bradley had recruited investors mostly through personal relationships, friends, family, people at his gym, people from our own extended family gatherings. He promised returns of 12 to 15% annually, which should have been the first red flag to anyone who understood real markets. Nothing legitimate performs that consistently, that safely, year after year. What Bradley was actually doing was something investigators call a Ponzi structure, though it was dressed up cleverly enough that it took real digging to prove. New investor money was being used to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of steady profit. Meanwhile, a significant portion of incoming funds were being redirected into Bradley's personal accounts, used to fund the lifestyle my family so admired. The leased luxury cars, the vacations, the down payment on the house Vanessa loved to show off in photos. And buried in the wire transfer records, appearing again and again over 3 years, were 2 names I knew personally. My mother and father had invested nearly all of their retirement savings into Bradley's fund. I remember reading that line in the transaction logs and having to step outside the building for air, because I understood something in that moment that none of them did yet. My parents believed they were sitting on a growing nest egg, thanks to their brilliant son-in-law. In reality, their savings were nearly gone, quietly bled out to keep Bradley's operation afloat, and the growth they saw on paper statements was pure fiction. I had a choice to make. I could recuse myself completely, walk away, let someone else uncover this, someone who wouldn't have to sit across from these people at Thanksgiving. Or I could do my job, carefully, thoroughly, and let the truth come out the way truth is supposed to come out. Through evidence, through process, through the law. I chose to do my job. There was one more person I need to tell you about before I go further, because he became important to how this entire investigation unfolded. His name was Marcus Reyes, a senior investigator on our team who had been doing this work for almost 20 years. Marcus had a reputation in our office for being unshakable, the kind of person who had seen every trick a con artist could invent and was never surprised by any of them anymore. When Diane assigned the case to me, she also assigned Marcus to work alongside me, partly for his experience, and partly, I think now, because she suspected how difficult this particular case would be for me personally. I told Marcus, honestly, on our first day working the file together, that the man under investigation was my sister's husband. He didn't blink. He just nodded slowly and said, "Then you already know something most investigators have to learn the hard way, that people who lie to strangers for money will lie to family for money just as easily, sometimes easier, because family doesn't ask questions." Marcus became something like a mentor to me over those 8 months, and more than that, he became someone I could be honest with when the weight of the case became difficult to carry alone. There were nights I sat in our office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at spreadsheets full of numbers that represented real people's real retirement funds, and Marcus would sit across from me with his own cup of terrible break room coffee and remind me why the work mattered. "You're not doing this to hurt anyone," he told me once. "You're doing this so the people who trusted the wrong person get a chance to recover what they can. That's it. That's the whole job. Everything else is noise." I held on to those words more than once during the months that followed. Before I go further into the investigation, I need to tell you about the dinner that happened right in the middle of it all, because it's the moment that changed how I felt about everything. It was my mother's 60th birthday. The whole family gathered at her favorite restaurant, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list nobody in my family could actually read, but everyone pretended to understand. I remember sitting near the end of the table, quiet as always, while Bradley held court at the center, telling a story about a 7-figure deal he'd apparently just closed. At some point, my father turned to me, maybe out of some sense of obligation to include his other daughter, and asked, "So Claire, anything exciting happening with you? Still doing the accounting thing?" I told him simply that I was working on a complex fraud case. I didn't say whose fraud. I couldn't say whose fraud. But I said the word fraud, hoping, in some small way, that it might make him pause. It didn't. Bradley laughed, an easy, dismissive laugh, and said, "Fraud cases, huh? Must be nice to have a job where you just look at spreadsheets all day and call it excitement." The table laughed with him. Even my mother, gently, politely, laughed along. Vanessa leaned over and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "Not everyone can be in the room where the real deals happen, Claire. Someone has to do the paperwork." I smiled. I said nothing. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, because if I had opened my mouth in that moment, I might have said something I couldn't take back yet. The investigation wasn't finished. The evidence wasn't locked down. And more than that, despite everything, some small part of me still hoped I was wrong. Some part of me hoped Bradley's fund really was legitimate, that my parents' money really was safe, that this would all resolve quietly with a correction and an apology to the pension board, and nobody at that table would ever have to know how close their world had come to collapse. I want to describe one more detail from that birthday dinner, because it's small, but it stayed with me. Toward the end of the night, as everyone was getting ready to leave, my mother pulled me aside near the coat closet and said quietly, almost apologetically, "You know we love you, Claire. We just worry about you sometimes. You could be doing so much more with your life." I remember standing there, coat half on, holding back the urge to tell her exactly how much I was already doing, how many people's futures I was quietly protecting at that very moment, how the case sitting on my desk involved more money and more real consequences than anything discussed at that entire dinner table. I said none of it. I simply told her I loved her too, and I went home. That car ride home was long and quiet. I remember gripping the steering wheel and thinking about how strange it was to be underestimated by the very people who were about to need me the most, though none of us knew it yet. That hope died 3 weeks later, when I found the second set of books. I need to tell you about one more thing that happened before I get to that discovery, because it shows you exactly the kind of pressure I was under during this period. About 2 weeks after that birthday dinner, my mother called me on a Sunday evening, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that made my chest tighten before she even explained why. She told me that Bradley had just offered to let her and my father get in early on a new fund he was launching, something he called an exclusive opportunity, available only to close family and a handful of longtime investors. She wanted to know if I thought it sounded like a good idea. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, phone pressed to my ear, trying to figure out how to answer a question I could not honestly answer without compromising an active investigation. I told her, as carefully and vaguely as I legally could, that she should be cautious about putting any additional money into any investment right now, that the market was unpredictable, that it was always wise to diversify rather than concentrate funds in one place. It was the truest thing I could say, without saying the thing I actually needed to say. She laughed softly and said, "Oh, Claire, you worry too much. That's the accountant in you. Bradley knows what he's doing. He always has." I hung up the phone that night and sat on my kitchen floor for a long time, feeling like I was standing at the edge of two versions of loyalty that were pulling in opposite directions. Loyalty to the law, to the process, to the hundreds of other families whose money was tied up in the same scheme, and loyalty to my own mother, who I desperately wanted to protect from what was coming. In the end, I chose to trust the process because I understood something that took me a long time to accept. Protecting her the right way meant letting the investigation run its full course, not tipping her off in a way that could unravel months of careful work and potentially let Bradley move whatever assets remained beyond the reach of investigators. It was one of the hardest decisions of my life, and to this day, I still think about that Sunday phone call more than almost anything else from that entire year. In forensic accounting, there's a moment every investigator both dreads and waits for. It's the moment you stop finding sloppy mistakes and start finding intentional design. Sloppy mistakes suggest incompetence. Intentional design proves someone knew exactly what they were doing every step of the way. I found that moment on a rainy Thursday, buried in a set of internal spreadsheets that Kessler Capital Partners had not submitted to the pension board. Spreadsheets we obtained through a subpoena after months of the company stonewalling our requests. These internal records told a different story than the one investors received. Investors were shown one number for the fund's total assets. Internally, Bradley's own team tracked a second number, the real number, which was less than a third of what investors believed existed. The gap between those two numbers was staggering. Millions of dollars that simply did not exist anymore, spent, transferred, vanished into personal accounts and lifestyle expenses, dressed up as business development costs. I sat with that file for hours, cross-referencing every entry, building a timeline, tracing every transfer back to its source and forward to its destination. This is the part of my job nobody at that dinner table ever asked about. The part that isn't glamorous or exciting to talk about at parties, but the part that actually protects people. Slow, careful, methodical, following the money until the money tells you the truth, because money, unlike people, cannot lie convincingly forever. There is always a trail. By the time I finished building the case file, it was clear. Bradley Kessler had been running what regulators would later formally classify as a Ponzi scheme, and my parents, trusting, proud, eager to believe their son-in-law was as successful as he claimed, had put nearly everything they had into it. I brought my findings to Diane. She reviewed every page, asked hard questions, tested every assumption I'd made, the way a good supervisor should. Then she looked at me and said quietly, "This is airtight, Claire. This is going to state prosecutors. This is going to court." I nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the weight of what was coming for my family, and underneath that weight, A smaller, harder feeling I wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny. Relief. Relief that finally, the truth would speak for itself, because I had spent years being unable to speak for myself. Diane asked me one more question before we closed that meeting, one that I want to share because it stayed with me. She asked, "Are you prepared for what happens to your relationship with your family after this becomes public?" I told her honestly that I didn't know. I told her that I had spent so long being underestimated by these people, that some small, wounded part of me almost welcomed the idea of them finally seeing what I was capable of, even under these terrible circumstances. But I also told her that the larger part of me, the part that mattered more, simply wanted my parents to get their money back and wanted Bradley to be stopped before he could hurt anyone else. Diane nodded and said something I've carried with me since. Good investigators want the truth. Great investigators want the truth, and they want the people it protects. Sounds like you're the second kind. The case moved from our internal review into a formal referral to the State Attorney General's office 2 weeks later. From that point forward, everything accelerated. Subpoenas were issued for Bradley's business bank accounts, his personal accounts, and the accounts of Kessler Capital Partners' handful of employees, most of whom, we would later learn, had no idea the true scale of what they were participating in. A forensic team was assigned to trace every dollar. My role shifted from lead discovery investigator to expert witness preparation, which meant spending long hours with the prosecuting attorneys, walking them through every spreadsheet, every wire transfer, every discrepancy, translating months of technical financial analysis into a story that a judge and, if it came to it, a jury could clearly understand. It was during this period that Bradley's fund finally began to collapse publicly, though not because anyone leaked our investigation. It collapsed the way these schemes always eventually collapse, under their own weight. New investor money slowed down. Withdrawal requests from existing investors increased as economic uncertainty made people nervous. Without enough new money coming in to pay off the old promises, the entire structure began to buckle. Investors who had never heard of a pension board investigation started noticing, on their own, that their statements didn't match their bank withdrawals. Panic set in. Bradley began stalling, offering excuses about temporary liquidity issues and market corrections, the same tired language every collapsing scheme uses in its final months. Before charges were filed, before the case became public, I had one impossible decision in front of me. Regulatory investigators are required to notify certain affected parties once fraud is confirmed and referred for prosecution, particularly when personal retirement funds are involved. My parents, as directly harmed investors, were on that notification list. I asked to be the one to deliver that notice, not because I wanted the moment, because I couldn't let my mother and father receive a cold letter from a state office with no context, no explanation, nothing but confusing legal language about recovered assets and restitution proceedings. I owed them more than that, even after everything. I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon. I remember my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way, not from fear of what they'd say to me, but from the horror of what I had to tell them about a man they had trusted with their life savings. I sat with them at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd been told my job was fun, where I'd been called an accountant like it was something small, and I explained, as gently and clearly as I could, what my investigation had uncovered. I explained the shell structure. I explained the second set of books. I explained that the retirement account they believed had grown to nearly $400,000 actually held less than $60,000. My mother's hand went to her mouth. My father sat perfectly still, staring at the table, his jaw tightening the way it always did right before he got angry. But this time, his anger had nowhere familiar to land. He couldn't yell at me for being wrong, because I wasn't wrong. I had documentation. I had 6 months of evidence. I had the full weight of a state investigation behind every word I said. Before he asked that question, there was a long, heavy silence at that table. one of the longest silences I have ever sat through in my life. My father stood up at one point and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where, 20 years earlier, he used to grill burgers every Sunday, while telling anyone who would listen how proud he was of Vanessa's latest achievement. He stood there with his back to me for what felt like several minutes, and when he finally turned around, his face had changed. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to disbelief. The look of a man realizing that the version of the world he had built his entire identity around had a crack running straight through the middle of it. "How long have you known?" my father finally asked, his voice low. "8 months," I said. "I couldn't tell you sooner. It would have compromised the investigation, and it might have let Bradley move whatever money was left before the state could freeze it." My mother looked up at me, tears in her eyes, and asked the question I knew was coming, the one that broke my heart even though I'd expected it. "Why didn't you say something at dinner? All those times we—" She stopped herself, unable to finish the sentence, unable to say out loud all the times they had laughed at my job, my nothing job, while I sat there quietly holding the exact information that would eventually save what little was left of their savings. I told her the truth. "Because it wasn't about me being right, Mom. It was about doing this the correct way, so that when it came time for a courtroom, nobody could say I acted out of anger or personal grievance. I needed this to be untouchable. For your sake, and for everyone else Bradley took money from." She didn't laugh at my job that day. Nobody did. Before I left their house that evening, my father walked me to my car, something he hadn't done in years. He stood in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, looking older than I'd ever seen him look, and he said quietly, "I always thought being impressive meant being loud about what you had. I never once considered that being impressive might mean quietly protecting people without needing credit for it." He didn't apologize that night. That would come later, at a different dinner, under different circumstances. But it was the first time in my entire life that my father looked at me like he was actually seeing me, instead of comparing me to someone else. I drove home that night and cried for the first time since the case began. Not out of sadness exactly, and not out of triumph either. It was something more complicated than either of those feelings. A kind of release, the particular exhaustion that comes after holding something enormous in secret for far too long, finally allowed to set some of that weight down. The criminal and civil proceedings against Bradley Kessler moved forward over the following year. State prosecutors filed formal charges related to securities fraud and misappropriation of investor funds. A parallel civil case was brought by the pension board and a group of affected investors, including my parents, seeking restitution. I was called to testify as the lead forensic auditor on the case. I want to describe that courtroom to you because it looked nothing like what people imagine from television. It was a modest room with pale wood paneling, uncomfortable benches, and a judge who spoke in a calm, measured voice that somehow made everything feel more serious, not less. My family sat together in the second row. My mother, my father, and, surprisingly, considering everything, my sister Vanessa, who had insisted on being there even though her own husband was the one on trial. I later learned Vanessa herself had discovered, only weeks before, that Bradley had also drained joint accounts she believed were untouched, accounts meant for their own future. She was, in her own way, one more person Bradley had betrayed. When I was called to the stand, the prosecutor asked me to walk the court through my findings. I explained my credentials first, as required. My licensing, my years of experience, the specific state authority I held to conduct financial investigations of this scale. I watched my father's face as I listed each qualification. I watched something shift in his expression, something between confusion and a discomfort he didn't know how to process. I then walked the judge through the evidence methodically, the same way I had built the case from the beginning. The 2 sets of books, the wire transfers, the gap between reported assets and real assets, the timeline showing exactly when new investor money was used to pay off earlier investors to maintain the illusion of legitimate returns. Bradley's defense attorney tried at length to challenge my findings, suggesting that the discrepancies could be explained by aggressive but legal accounting practices and market volatility. I answered each challenge calmly, with documentation, with dates, with numbers that could not be argued with because they were simply true. I want to describe one exchange from that cross-examination specifically, because it was the moment I felt the entire room's perception of me shift. Bradley's attorney, a tall man with an expensive suit and a practiced, condescending tone, asked me, "Ms. Whitmore, isn't it true that you have a personal relationship with the defendant? That he is, in fact, your brother-in-law?" "Yes," I answered. "That's correct." "And isn't it also true," he continued, clearly hoping to plant doubt about my objectivity, "that personal relationships like this can create bias in an investigation?" I answered calmly, the way Marcus had coached me to answer exactly this kind of question. "They can, which is precisely why every finding in this case is supported by documentary evidence, not personal testimony. I didn't rely on my opinion of Mr. Kessler. I relied on wire transfer records, bank statements, internal spreadsheets obtained through subpoena, and sworn statements from Kessler Capital employees. Every number I presented today can be independently verified by any qualified forensic accountant reviewing the same records. My relationship to Mr. Kessler doesn't change what those records show." The attorney tried a different angle. "But surely, given that relationship, you might have had motive to pursue this investigation more aggressively than warranted." I looked at him and said, "If anything, sir, my relationship to Mr. Kessler gave me more reason to hope I was wrong. I would have been relieved to close this investigation with no findings. Instead, I found a second set of financial records that don't match what investors were told, redirected transfers into personal accounts, and a pattern of using new investor funds to pay earlier investors. I didn't create those numbers. I found them." He had no follow-up question after that. He sat down. I remember Marcus, sitting in the gallery, giving me the smallest, quietest nod, the kind of nod that told me he knew exactly how much preparation had gone into that answer and how much it mattered that I hadn't let a single word rattle me. After nearly 2 hours of testimony, the judge turned to address the courtroom directly. This is the moment I want to describe carefully, because it is the moment everything changed. The judge looked over the evidence one final time, then looked toward the defense table, then toward the gallery where my family sat, and said in a calm and deliberate voice, "This court has rarely seen an investigation this thorough, this well-documented, and this clearly a product of genuine professional integrity. Ms. Whitmore's work here represents exactly the kind of diligence that protects working families and retirees from exactly this sort of scheme." The room went quiet. I saw my mother's hand reach for my father's. I saw Vanessa's eyes fill with tears, not for her husband, but I think, in that moment, for me, for the years she had spent calling my work small, without ever knowing what it actually meant. And then the judge said the words that silenced my entire family completely. "Given the scope and precision of this investigation, and the direct role it played in protecting not only the plaintiffs in this courtroom, but hundreds of additional pension holders across this state, I want to note for the record that this is the kind of work too often dismissed as unremarkable. Quiet, careful, unglamorous work that, in this case, has recovered millions of dollars and prevented further harm to families who trusted the wrong people with their futures." 11 words stayed with me longer than any others in that statement. The kind of work too often dismissed as unremarkable. My father did not look at me right away. He stared straight ahead, at the judge, at the defense table, at anything but my face. My mother was openly crying now, silently, her hand pressed to her mouth. And Bradley, the man who once laughed at spreadsheets all day, sat with his head down, unable to look at anyone in that room. The judge continued for another moment, addressing the broader significance of the case, noting for the record that the investigation had helped the pension board tighten its due diligence procedures for future fund partnerships, and that the recovery process, though still ongoing, had already identified a path to returning a meaningful portion of the missing funds to investors. There is a strange stillness that falls over a courtroom in moments like that, a kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise ever could. I sat in the witness chair, aware of every eye in that gallery, aware that for the first time in my life, my family was looking at me not as the quiet daughter with the forgettable job, but as the person who had, in the judge's own words, protected them. I stepped down from the stand a few minutes later, and as I walked back toward the gallery to take my seat, my mother reached out and took my hand, squeezing it once, tightly, without saying a word. She didn't need to say anything. I understood exactly what that squeeze meant. Before I move forward to the verdict, I want to tell you about someone else, because this case was never only about my family, and I think it's important that you understand the full scope of what Bradley's scheme had actually done. Her name was Rosalind Ferris, and she was 71 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent 38 years in the same classroom before retiring with a modest pension and a small nest egg she and her late husband had built together. She had been introduced to Bradley through a mutual acquaintance at a community fundraiser, and like so many others, she had been drawn in by his easy confidence, his polished language, his promises of steady, safe returns. I met Rosalind during the investigation, when investigators reached out to affected parties to gather victim impact statements for the eventual sentencing hearing. She sat across from me at a small folding table in a community center conference room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and told me that she had put nearly her entire retirement savings into Kessler Capital Partners, because Bradley had personally assured her, over coffee, that it was safer than a savings account, and a lot smarter. I trusted him because he seemed so sure of himself, she told me. I didn't understand the paperwork, not really, but he seemed to understand it so well, I thought that was enough. I sat with Rosalind for almost 2 hours that day, walking her through, gently, what had actually happened to her money, and watching her absorb the news the way I imagine a person absorbs news of a diagnosis, slowly, in pieces, needing to hear it more than once before it fully lands. She didn't cry in front of me. She simply nodded, thanked me for my honesty, and said something before I left that I have never forgotten. At least someone finally looked closely enough to find the truth. Most people don't bother. They just assume men like him must know what they're doing, because they sound like they do. I carried that sentence with me through the rest of the investigation, and I carry it with me still. Rosalind was one of over 60 individual investors affected by Bradley's fund, alongside the pension board itself, which represented hundreds of additional retirees indirectly. Every single one of those people trusted a confident voice over a careful one. Every single one of those people is a small reminder of why the quiet, careful, boring work my family used to laugh about actually matters. Because somebody has to be the person willing to look past the confidence and check the numbers. The court found Bradley Kessler guilty on multiple counts of securities fraud. He was ordered to pay restitution to every investor his fund had defrauded, prioritized according to hardship, which meant retirees and pension holders, including my own parents, were placed near the front of the recovery line. He received a custodial sentence as well, though I won't dwell on the specifics of his punishment here, because punishment was never the part of the story I cared about. Restoration was. Over the following months, the court-appointed receiver worked to recover what assets could be recovered: properties, liquidated investments, frozen accounts, and distribute them back to the people Bradley had taken from. My parents did not get back everything they had lost. Nobody in cases like this ever does, but they recovered enough to stabilize their retirement, enough to rebuild what had nearly been destroyed, and they recovered it specifically because of the case I had built. Evidence I had gathered while sitting quietly at family dinners where I was mocked for the very skills that ended up saving them. Vanessa's marriage did not survive the aftermath, and I won't pretend that was an easy thing to witness, even given everything Bradley had done. She moved back in temporarily with our parents while she rebuilt her own finances, and in that strange, quiet period, something shifted between the two of us. She started asking me real questions about my work. Not mocking questions, not dismissive ones, but genuine curiosity. She told me once, late at night in our parents' kitchen, That she used to assume my job was boring because she never understood it, and that not understanding something had made it easier to look down on it. I told her I understood. I told her most people don't respect what they don't take the time to learn. It wasn't an insult when I said it. It was just something I'd come to accept a long time ago. There was one particular night, a few weeks after the trial ended, that I think about often. Vanessa came into the guest room where I was staying for the weekend, sat down on the edge of the bed, and asked me, quietly, whether I had known, deep down, before the investigation even started, that something was wrong with Bradley's business. I told her the truth, that I had never suspected anything until the case landed on my desk by pure chance, that I hadn't gone looking for a reason to expose him, that I had, in fact, hoped desperately to find nothing at all. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me. I think some part of me always knew something didn't add up. He never let me look too closely at the accounts. He always had an answer ready before I even finished asking a question. I just didn't want to be the one who ruined it, so I stopped asking. She looked down at her hands and added, "I used to think you were the sister who didn't take risks. Turns out you were the one brave enough to actually look at the truth instead of looking away from it." I didn't have a clever response to that. I just reached over and held her hand, the way I hadn't done since we were children. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like there was a hierarchy between us anymore. It just felt like two sisters, both a little worn down by what the last year had cost them, sitting quietly together in the dark. A year after the trial, my family gathered again for my mother's birthday, this time at her house instead of the restaurant. It was a smaller, quieter gathering. No expensive wine list, no loud stories about seven-figure deals. At one point during dinner, my father cleared his throat and, in front of everyone, said something he had never said to me before. He said, "I want to apologize to Claire." The table went quiet. He continued, his voice rougher than usual. "I spent years calling your work a nothing job. I did that because I didn't understand it, and because I was more comfortable being impressed by things that were loud and easy to brag about, instead of things that were quiet and actually mattered. You spent 8 months building a case that saved this family, and you did it without ever once making us feel small for how we'd treated you. I don't know many people who could have done that. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago." I didn't cry, though I came close. I told him simply that I appreciated hearing it, and that what mattered most to me wasn't the apology itself, but knowing that he and my mother had their future back, stable and secure. My mother added something of her own that night, something I think about often. She said, "We spent so much time being impressed by people who were good at looking successful, and so little time noticing who was actually being responsible. I'm sorry it took almost losing everything for me to see the difference." I think about that courtroom often, not the verdict, not even the restitution, but that one sentence from the judge, the kind of work too often dismissed as unremarkable. I think about how many people, in how many families, are sitting quietly at dinner tables right now, being underestimated for jobs that don't come with flashy titles or impressive stories to tell at parties. I think about how easy it is to mistake quiet competence for lack of ambition, and how easy it is to mistake loud confidence for real success. Bradley was loud. Bradley was confident. Bradley had a story for every occasion, and my family loved him for it, right up until the moment his entire story collapsed under the weight of real evidence. I was quiet. I asked for nothing. I built my case one careful transaction at a time, not because I wanted revenge, but because doing the work correctly was the only way it would ever mean anything. If there is a lesson in this story, it is this: the value of a person's work is rarely measured by how impressive it sounds at a dinner table. It is measured by what that work protects, what it uncovers, and who it ultimately saves. My family laughed at my nothing job for years. That nothing job saved their future. And in the end, it wasn't my words that finally made them understand. It was a judge's quiet, measured statement, spoken in a courtroom that didn't care about impressive stories, only the truth. I think, too, about Marcus Reyes, the mentor who sat with me through so many long nights of that investigation, and about the countless investigators like him working quietly in offices most people will never think to thank. I think about Diane Okafor, who trusted me with a case most supervisors would have handed to someone else out of caution. I think about Rosalind Ferris, who taught me that dignity doesn't disappear just because your savings do, and that gratitude can exist even in the middle of enormous loss. Every one of these people did their part in a story that, on the surface, looked like it was only about one family's reckoning. It was always about more than that. I also think about Bradley, and I want to say something honest about him, because this story isn't served well by pretending he was simply a cartoon villain. Bradley wasn't born wanting to hurt people. Somewhere along the way, he made a series of small choices, a shortcut here, a comforting lie there, that eventually hardened into a pattern he couldn't find his way out of without everything collapsing around him. I don't say this to excuse what he did. The consequences he faced were consequences he earned, fully and completely. But I think it's worth remembering that these schemes rarely start with someone twirling a mustache, plotting harm. They start with someone convincing themselves that just this once, a small deception will fix a bigger problem, and then discovering there's no clean way back out. That's part of why the quiet, careful work matters so much. Not because it punishes people for being confident, but because it protects everyone else from confidence that isn't backed by truth. I never went looking for that moment of vindication. It found me, because I did the work, quietly, honestly, for 8 long months, without ever needing anyone to notice. That, I've come to believe, is what real strength looks like. Not the loudest voice at the table, the steadiest hand doing the work nobody else was willing to do. It has been almost 2 years since that afternoon in the courtroom, and I want to close this story by telling you where everyone ended up, because I think endings matter, and I don't want to leave you wondering. My parents rebuilt their retirement, slower than they would have liked, but steadily. My father took a part-time consulting position in his old industry, something he swore he'd never do again after retiring, and my mother started volunteering twice a week at the same community center where I had once sat with Rosalind Ferris, helping coordinate financial literacy workshops for retirees. She told me once that she wanted to help make sure fewer people ended up in Rosalind's position, trusting the wrong voice simply because it was the most confident one in the room. I think that volunteer work healed something in her that the court case alone never could have. Vanessa eventually moved into her own apartment, rebuilt her career from the ground up, and started slowly to date again, though far more cautiously than before. She calls me now, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to ask a genuine question about her own finances, always with the kind of respect that took 30 years and one devastating betrayal to finally arrive. Rosalind Ferris, along with most of the other affected investors, eventually received a partial restitution payment through the court-ordered recovery process. It wasn't everything they lost. It rarely is in cases like this. But it was enough, in her words, to know that somebody in this whole mess actually cared enough to fight for it. As for me, I still work the same job. I still sit at a desk most days, reviewing spreadsheets, tracing transactions, building cases one careful line at a time. It still doesn't come with a flashy title or a story that sounds impressive at a party. But I no longer need it to. I learned through all of this that the value of the work was never something I needed my family or anyone else to validate for me. It simply needed to be true, and it needed to matter to the people it protected. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that judge's voice in the courtroom, calm and steady, saying the words that finally made my family understand what I had known about myself for years, the kind of work too often dismissed as unremarkable. I think about how many people are living that same sentence right now, in their own families, at their own dinner tables, quietly doing something meaningful, while the people around them assume it must be nothing, simply because it doesn't come wrapped in noise. If that's you, watching this right now, I want you to hear something my father finally said to me, a year too late, but true all the same. The quiet work is often the work that matters most. Someday, in some room, in some way you might not expect, the truth of what you've built will speak for itself. And when it does, you won't need to be the loudest person in the room to be heard. You'll simply need to have done the work honestly, one careful step at a time, the way I did. That was my nothing job. It turned out to be everything.